populist to me is inherently authoritarian. And this might seem a little bit counterintuitive because, authoritarianism is like rule of the one and the populism is kind of rule of the people. But they are actually very closely aligned. And the reason they are aligned in that in a liberal democracy, you can't have all the people ruling all the time, right? It's like even in ancient city-states, where that were democracies in Greece, they were very afraid of populist demagogues because you need somebody to represent the people. So you can either have a strongman represent the people, or you can, put the popular will through institutions of liberal democracy, parliaments and courts, and, you can have a constitution that limits what a majoritarian democracy can do, because a majoritarian democracy can be extremely, extremely authoritarian. It can just choose to take away the rights of minorities by voting against them, right? And so for that reason, populism and authoritarianism are very closely tied, because if populism is the rule of the people unmediated by these structures that constrain, the vote, the majority, it very soon lapses into strongman politics. And you've seen that kind of happen in the United States, and populism and illiberalism, some form of illiberalism and authoritarianism always go hand in hand, and libertarians are actually not immune to this dynamic.
Mm-hmm. For when you mentioned the Cato Institute, to clarify, there definitely are some libertarian institutions that still do good libertarian work. I just found that in my real life, anybody that identified as a libertarian, it's funny you bring up the Cato Institute, because anytime you want to argue immigration stuff,
Yes.
there are a few guys over there that do really, really, really great work.
Alex Naraste.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. They do really great work on it. Everybody that I know in real life that call themselves a libertarian hates these people because they're like, these guys think they think that illegal immigrants are destroying the economy and blah blah blah. But so I do agree with you 100% that the actual libertarian think tanks and some of these guys still do really great work. But for whatever reason, a lot of Republicans just started calling themselves libertarian. I think off of the Tea Party movement. So you get a lot of these people who are just Republican, conservative, post neocon types who call themselves libertarian. They're not at all. Right. Something you brought up that was really funny.
Just very quickly.
Yeah.
Very often, I've met a lot of libertarians who call themselves libertarians because the Republican Party is not right-wing enough.
Yeah.
So they are to the right of Republicans, and so they call themselves libertarians because what else? Because there's no other terminology for them. They're not going to call themselves fascists or Nazis, which is sometimes what they are.
Yeah.
So they start calling themselves libertarians.
That was the Tea Party. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly the Tea. Well, Tea Party. Here's the interesting thing: when the Tea Party first started, they were not as bad as they became. Once, especially after Trump came along and Sarah Palin came along. Believe it or not, I had spoken at Tea Party meetings where I spoke about, open immigration and liberalizing our immigration policies. And the argument I used to make, which used to go down well once upon a time, now I'll probably get stoned if I made this argument in a right-wing space. But the argument I used to make was, you want the economy and you want businesses and families and individuals to be making the decisions about who should come into the country, right? Not central planners sitting in Washington, D.C. They cannot plan an entire labor market. Our market is too complex. It's you can't have Washington bureaucrats sitting and thinking, what does Microsoft want versus what does an agricultural company want? So let sort of the market decide who comes in. And that argument used to play once upon a time. I don't think it would anymore.
It was before Glenn Beck captured it.
Yes.
Yeah. I grew up a massive conservative. My mom is Cuban, so all the old conservative stuff. My mom loves Sarah Palin and everything. Yeah. Another thing you brought up that was very funny to me is you bring up this concept of libertarianism. People can have these axioms, but then where you go from there is very different. I learned this several years ago, and I say this a lot, and I remind people a lot when I debate. I really don't care what a person's principles are. We have to give some examples, because people will give you similar axioms, and then they'll just on a completely different level. A person could say, I think in the United States of America, I think in the United States of America, everybody needs to be free to have families and then raise their kids and then empower those children to be the most productive units possible. Therefore, and then one person will say, that's why we need absolutely no taxes and families need to be free to do whatever with no government restrictions. And then the other person will say, this is why we need to massively increase taxes and make childcare free and then give them a free education. Not to say one is right or wrong, but just people can come from a similar like principled place, but then on the pathway to actually having applied, positions, they end up in totally different areas. So somebody just giving me like, I'm ABC political label or I have ABC philosophy. It's like, okay, tell me what you actually want to do because these can mean totally different things.
Right.
And then
And
go ahead.
and you see it being you see it played out in a whole lot of issues. I mean, immigration is one of them. The welfare state is another one. How big a welfare state, whether you need, you may believe in families. That doesn't mean it's going to tell you anything about your position on the welfare state, right? You may believe in families and you may think that a welfare state is destructive for families, and you may believe in families and say the welfare state is good for families, right? You can have that, so those can be different positions, even though your end goal is the same. That's actually different from what I'm talking about, which is that you actually believe at some level in the same first principles, not the same necessarily like goals, not the same end point for society, but in some ways the same beginning point for society. So freedom can be a first principle, but what you do with freedom can be entirely different things. So freedom in this country has been used to abolish slavery, and freedom has been used in this country to actually justify slavery. I mean, it's kind of like that kind of wild divergence that you see in the name of the same principle is difficult to sort out. And I agree with you. You actually have to ask them about their positions on specific issues, not just name what they stand for, because that won't tell you anything.
One of the big on this topic, maybe I expressed it poorly with the last example, but like a really big point that comes up a lot, there's a lot of disagreement over, has to do with the concept of like freedom of speech. And it's very, very, very difficult to talk about. The example I always use is that, like, if you have the principle of like freedom of speech is like essential for a functioning democracy. If you like, everybody should be free to voice their opinion on things. If you have a room with 10 people who are screaming at the top of their lungs, in some ways, maybe this is like the ultimate expression of that principle of freedom of speech. And then in another room, you might have 9 people, and then one guy has a gun, and he says, "You're going to speak one at a time." That room seems like less free and more authoritarian and less freedom of speech. But at the end of the day, I mean, that room might actually have better freedom of speech than the one where it's just 10 people screaming at each other all day. And it's very hard to get people to kind of understand sometimes that, like, we have these like foundational principles, and then I'm going to loop this back into this kind of like populist stuff. You have these foundational principles, but we really have to think sometimes, I think, about what those are in service to, and not just like look at them as like a thing on their own, because it's so, I feel like it's very naive, or it's very childlike, or it's very just kind of like silly sometimes to be like, oh, well, I believe in this particular freedom, and that's why there can be absolutely no restrictions, or that's why this has to be it has to work this way in every single way, size, shape, or form, even though it's like completely destructive or antithetical to that foundational thing, completely. And I feel like the populist stuff that we're getting to is expressing a lot of that. So you mentioned this thing that like populism kind of lends itself to authoritarianism. One of the great contradictions of the Republican Party, I don't know if you heard them say this a lot, but they say this all the time: we live in a republic, not a democracy. They would always say this because they could never win the popular vote.
Right.
And then as soon as Trump won the popular vote, every time Trump does something that I would argue is authoritarian, people are like, well, he won the popular vote, so he has the will of the people behind him. And I'm like, what?
Right. Yeah. No, I have the exact same reaction with a lot of folks I talk to on the right these days. I've actually stopped talking to a lot of them because I just can't deal with it, but to the extent that I do, it's kind of like mind-bending how quickly they gave up on their principles of limited government and freedom of speech and a non-activist Supreme Court. All of that kind of like fell by the wayside. But going back to your, you made a very interesting analogy when it came to speech, right? And one of if you ever go to watch Indian television, it is that situation that you describe where there are 10 people screaming at each other at the same time, and they have, like, you'll have different windows for each of them on the screen, and they'll all be talking at the same time, and you have no idea what the hell anybody is saying.
Okay.
And then you look at the American context, where it's very orderly. There are social norms that govern who talks. It's rude to interrupt. Everybody gets to have their say. And I think the difference is, and in India, interestingly, there is a far less robust, First Amendment or free speech tradition, which is against government censorship. And in America, you have a far more robust system of First Amendment free speech. And that's where the difference is, which is that, free speech was never meant to be a complete license to say anything you want at any time you want without any time, place, and manner restrictions. Even in a First Amendment context, the government is supposed to impose a time, place, and manner restrictions so that, people can say what they need to say and not be too disruptive. And yet, what you've got over here are strong social norms to govern the way that speech is conducted, so that, you can, to your point, what is the point of free speech? The point of free speech is debate and discussion, so that you can get to the final truth. That was the whole John Stuart Mill idea of marketplace of ideas. Ideas, they jostle with each other, you talk to each other, you debate, and then finally, from that debate, a better, synthesis emerges of what's right and wrong. But I think what's happening in America, and what generally happens in a populist system, is that the majority starts chafing at any social restrictions on its speech, and it starts seeing self-regulation as repression. So it starts seeing it's any idea of responsible exercise of your rights as censorship. And when that happens, it justifies its using, the levers of the state to slam down on the speech of groups that it doesn't like. This is what Trump is doing. He's taking on the Justice Department and opening up all these DEI investigations against universities. He's tying their federal funding to whether they have DEI programs or not. It becomes very, very easy to justify actual government censorship when the social mechanisms for self-regulation of speech are considered to be repression. If that makes any sense.
It 1,000,000,000% makes sense. So I don't know if you can tell or not, but I'm a young white man, and one of the things on the internet that we do is we're very edgy sometimes, okay? Especially in gamer spaces. There are certain arguments that I would make in the past, and I would have to be very careful when I would argue with things. So I appreciate a lot of edgy humor. Some of this humor might be racial or sexist or whatever, but I ideally enjoyed it in a responsible manner, not like just people being hateful. But one thing I noticed a lot, when I would make these arguments 5 or 10 years ago, is I would have to be so careful about defending any type of edgy humor, because the second that I defend it, 98% of the people next to me are usually just people who just want to be racist. So I'm like, okay, I have to be very mindful when I make these arguments, because everybody that's agreeing with me is actually just using me to enforce a status quo. And I don't really want them to change my opinion, but it's a thing you have to be mindful of. And to your point on the freedom of speech thing, the lack of social regulation and the conflation of that with the First Amendment, where, so if people are going to be spamming or saying these things on this platform, that, maybe you shouldn't be on this platform, and people are like, what about the First Amendment? And it's like, the government is not censoring you. What are you talking about? And every single time, I'm very sympathetic towards all the ideas of, well, who should regulate speech? And this is a really difficult thing to do. And it is a difficult question. But the second you bring up, I think freedom of speech is important. And I think marketplace of ideas is important. I notice that almost everybody around me is just somebody who wants to use that First Amendment thing as a license to lie with impunity, with no social regulation or responsibility whatsoever. And I'm like, is this really what it is, that every foundational, liberal principle is just going to be hijacked by somebody who wants to use it to abuse and destroy the system? And then in service of creating an illiberal society, because I would argue that that's kind of where we've wound up in the United States. That thing, that drives me crazy.
Yeah. No, the whole marketplace of ideas metaphor, it depends upon good faith participants in the marketplace, right?
Yes.
If you have people who are, bad faith, who just want to flood the zone with shit, in the memorable words of Steve Bannon, who don't care about right or wrong, they just want their side to win. It is a kind of violence that they do to our existing system, because what they want to do is choke up sort of this marketplace of ideas, so that people can't actually sift right from wrong. They sow so much doubt, so much confusion, that the whole epistemic infrastructure kind of like breaks down. It can't sort through what's right and wrong. And when you have vandals like that, you can't have a functioning system, which is why the internet is kind of leading to a breakdown of actual conversation. And I would further argue what that does is it actually leads to government censorship of exactly what you were talking about. Then you actually need a guy with a gun, to tell somebody to stay quiet while the other person is talking, right? So that's when you actually empower the state, is when you get bad faith actors who will not play by these norms and these rules that have developed over centuries and centuries, and call those into question. And I really do think we are at that danger point in America and in the rest of the world right now.
I would argue for the U.S. We've gone past it with Trump. The political prosecutions have gotten insane.
Yeah.
Obviously, we used to joke a lot that it's not your First Amendment right to not be banned from a social media platform, but I'm pretty sure like 5 of them settled multi-million-dollar lawsuits with Trump to pay him out because they didn't want to get sued or have their parent company mergers blocked.